Be'ezus Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Zevachim Daf Mem Dalet 44, and we will begin on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis. Um, Amar Mar. It's about I would say 10 lines from the wide lines. Amar Mar, Rebbe Omer. We are discussing over here psukim to try to define, to try to understand what this pasuk means. First of all, the pasuk says, "V'hanefesh shetoicha b'achsam mizevach hashlamim asher Hashem." If you eat the meat of a shlamim, v'tumasoi alav, and you have tuma on you, on who? Does it mean the tuma is on the meat, or the tuma is on the person? So if that happens, the Torah tells you, "V'nichrusa nefesh ahimi is me'amer." The person gets kares. But the question is, who has the tuma, the person or the basar? So we know that this pasuk is teaching me that the person has the tuma, and we try to the different tanoim brought proofs to their understanding how we know that for a fact that this pasuk is talking about the person has the tuma and he's eating regular shlamim. He gets kares. So then Rebbe says, "I'll prove it to you," because the next pasuk says the same idea. The pasuk says, "V'nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei b'tumas adam behema tmeya ay b'chol sheretz hashek it's tamei v'achal mibsar sevach hashlam hashel Hashem v'nichus nefesh he." The next pasuk says that the person who touches tamei, so the person is tamei, and he eats shlamim, he gets kares. Same idea. So then this pasuk must also refer to where the person became tamei and he ate shlamim. And you're going to ask me a question. Why do I need two psukim to tell you get kares if a person's tummy eats kachim? They both saying the same idea, so that the Gemara will speak about later on. So the proof of Rebbe was that since this pasuk says va'achal and he ate, so this pasuk must be also referring to where the person was tamei. So the Gemara just elaborates just for a moment on what Rebbe said. We start from over here. Amar Mar. Amar Mar. Here we go. Amar Mar. We learned in the Brisa. Rebbe Yomi. Rebbe says, Va'achal. The pasuk says, Va'achal b'tumas haguf hakasim nedaber. The Torah is talking about where the individual is tamei. Says the Gemara, my mashma. How does that tell you about the previous pasuk that it's also talking about where the individual is tamei? Amar Rava says this concept over here. Kol kra, any pasuk, doloi mefarshe le Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi didn't explain it. Any pasuk in the Chumash that wasn't explained by Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, really you didn't get it. V'chol misnisa doloi mefarshe le Rav Zeiri, and any brisa that was not explained by Zeiri, loy mi parsha is not explained well. So really, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi is going to explain the psukim, and he's, by the way, going to explain what Rebbe meant. Hachi Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi explained the proof of Rebbe. Hoyel pasuk hakoseh b'lashon nekeva. The pasuk began with a feminine word, v'sayim b'lashon nekeva, and it ended with a feminine word, b'lashon zacha be'emtza, and it had a male word in the middle. Tumas haguf hakoseh b'daber. So the pasuk is talking about a tumas haguf. In other words, if you look at this pasuk, let's say the pasuk v'hanefesh is a feminine word, the soul. Ashtekaba mizevach hashlamim asher Hashem. V'tumasoi oleha, it should say. If it's going on the person, it should say v'tumasoi oleha. So it seems to indicate v'tumasoi olav, it's going on the meat. That's the indication. But then you see in this next pasuk, where it's clearly talking about where the person had tamei, where the person himself was tamei. There the pasuk says v'nefesh asher siga b'chol tamei. He touched a tamei, v'achal, and he ate. So he sees, even though it starts with a feminine and turns into a masculine, it's still referring to the person himself, right? And ends with feminine. So therefore, this pasuk also, though it starts with a feminine word, don't be confused that it turns into a masculine word of olav. It's still referring to where the individual himself was tamei, the person is tamei, and the basar is tar, and yet that's why you would get kares. So that was the psukim explained according to Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Dini. Now we're going to have a little brisa. We just mentioned, Rabbi said that Zeiri was the best at explaining brises, cryptic brises. So let's see a cryptic brisa, and Zeiri is going to explain it. Masnit is a brisa that says, the Tanya we learned in a brisa, there's a concept where the Torah tells you on a light avera of Tumah, you get Malchus. On a severe Avera of Tumah, you also get Malchus. So the Brisa says, Nemra Kalas, Lama Nemra Chumuris. Nemra Chamuris, Lama Nemra Kalas. Why does the Torah have to tell you by both the severe Avera and the light Avera, you both get Malchus? Just tell it by one. So the Gemara says, the Brisa says, Im nema akalis v'loy chamuris. If it just tell you by the light avera that you get malchus and not the chamuris, I would have thought al akalis belav al chamuris b'misa, that if you do the severe avera you get misa. It's only if you do the light avera you get a malchus. Kach nema chamuris. That's why the Torah tells you chamuris. That if you do the severe avera, you also get malchus. Nema chamuris v'lenema kalis. If it just say chamuris and doesn't say kalis, so I would have thought halachamuris yechayev alakalas yehei pater. I would think that you on the severe avera you get malchus, but a light avera you don't get anything. Lekachnema kalas. That's why the Torah tells you, but even on a light avera you also get malchus. But this Bryce is very cryptic. My kalas or my chamuris. What does it mean? A light avera? What means a severe avera? Now there are two ways to have a tumah on a light avera. Either what you're eating is a light thing, like Maisa Sheni, or and a severe thing would be truma. And truma, you have to be super tar to eat truma. You have to go to mikveh and have her shemesh. Or light means you had a light tuma. You had a tuma sheretz. Severe could mean that you had a severe tuma, which means a tumas mace. So the Gemara tries to explain the brisa in two different ways. It doesn't make sense. And then Zeiri says, I have a third way to explain the brisa, which combines both. The Gemara says like this: Ile mekalis means meiser, chamuras truma, and what the Bryce is saying that, but both meiser, if you eat meiser when you're tummy, and when you eat truma when you're tummy, you get malchus. Misa, you only get. I would have thought that you get misa. Now the Torah tells you that truma you get only malchus. Hashanami habe misa. We know that if you eat truma betuma, you also get misa b'dei shemayim. The im loinem usul im loinem yisoyim b'misa diala b'minin liyas kanidim. And what's your point? The Brisa also is a little difficult. That if it didn't say that Truma gets Malchus, I would think that you get Misa. Wait a second. If it's a Kal V'chomer that you're learning it from Meiser, that if you get Malchus, so why would I jump that by Truma you certainly should get Misa? It should be at the very least like Meiser. The bottom line is, it cannot be that the Brisa is saying that Truma, if you eat Truma Betuma, you get Malchus, because that's not true. Ella kalas means betumas sharets, chamuras tumas mace. It depends what you have. If you touch the sharets, or chamuras means you're a tamei mace. Uvamai, what did you eat? Ibit truma. If you eat truma, so the Bryce is saying you had tumas mace, and the Bryce is saying that whether you eat uh, uh, whether you eat truma with a tumas sheretz or a tumas mace, you get malchus. Ibit truma, misa. You get misa for both. The truth is that even chamuris, no matter what what tuma you have on you, and you eat truma, the Torah tells you get misa. If it's talking about that you eat meiser, and that when you eat maisa with a tumas sheretz, or when you eat maisa with a tumas mace, you get malchus, okay. But then we go to Amid Aleph, we go to Mem Dal Adamav, im loy nemra chamuris, if it didn't say chamuris, yisoim al chamuris memisa. How could I say that if the Torah didn't tell you that if you eat trumas, if you eat maisa when you have a tumas mace on you, you get you get malchus, I would think that you get misa. You're learning it from a sheretz with love bin is kanidin. It should be exactly like a tumas sheretz. When you eat meiser, you get malchus. So even if the Torah didn't tell you that when you have a tumas mace and you eat meiser, you get malchus, I would always say that you get malchus because love bin is kanidin. It has to be similar to to when you eat maisa when you have a tumas sheretz on you. Bottom line is that this brisa makes no sense. Amaziri, the way you explain the brisa is you combine the two. Kales is tumas sheretz, chamura is tumas meis, v'hochi kamar, and this is what the brisa means to say. Ilu nema tumas sheretz v'nema maisa utruma. If we just say tumas sheretz, and the Torah would tell you by when you're tumas sheretz and you eat meiser, you get lav. When you're tumas sheretz and you eat truma, what do you get? Misa. V'loy nemer tumas meis, and the Torah wouldn't tell you anything what happens when you eat meiser or what happens when you eat truma when you have a tumas meis. Hoyisa oima, I would have thought, well, al hakalos belav. Alakalis belav, valchamuris b'misa. When you have a tumas sheretz and you eat maisa, you get a lav, and when you eat truma, you get misa. Umidikalas alachamuris b'misa. And since when you eat tumas, when you have a tumas sheretz and when you eat truma, you get misa. So chamurais, but if you have a tumas maze, name alakalos, if you eat maisa sheni, b'misa, you would get misa. And you don't say daya love min and kiniyas kenidim because kalas and chamurais also gets misa. So I would say chamurais alakalos would get misa. The kach nemra chamurais. That's why the Torah tells you chamurais that even if you have a tumas mace on you, if you eat maisa sheni, you only get a lav. If you eat truma, you would get misa. So you see that Ziri had this knack in explaining very cryptic prices. Okay, back in our Gemara. Any part of the animal that has something that matters it to be eaten. For example, the blood matters the carbon to be eaten by a person. The blood is matter the carbon, the amorim, to be eaten by Hashem on the Mizbeach. Those parts, chayavon le'mishim pigel. If a person would eat them, he would be chayav on pigel. Taner Rabbana. We learned now this concept of pigel was said by hold on. It was said by this pigel notion was said in this pasuk over here. It was said by a shlomim. So we see pigel applies by which carbon? Carbon shlomim. Tanarbana. I would only think that pigel applies by carbonas which are like a shlamim. Ma shlamim yuchadim nechol shnei v'layla echad, just like a carbon shlamim is eaten for 2 days and 1 night. I would think av kol nechol shnei v'layla echad. I would think that pigel only applies by a carbon that could be eaten for 2 days and 1 night, that would only include, let's say, a bachar. How do I know if a carbon is eaten by day and by night? Let's say carbon toida or carbochatas. How do you know pigel would apply by that? Talmud loymin b'bsar, because the pasuk says mi b'sar zavach shlamim. Here we go, mi b'sar shavach shlamim. So mi b'sar adds any meat of a carbon, even a carbon chatas. Says the Gemara, oila b'sar kol shishrai nechol. If you have a carbon that is you have part of the carbon is eaten by human beings, pigel applies. How do you know pigel will apply by a carbon oila? Oila shein sheyoreh. How do you know it would apply also by carbon oila? No part of the carbon oila is eaten by human being. How do you know that pigel would apply? Talmud loy zevach. The pasuk says mipsar zevach. Shlomo zevach adds even a carbon oila. So that's what we see from this pasuk. Now, how do I know to apply minayan l'rabes ha'oifis v'hamanochos achani marba loik shemesh hamotzayra? How do I know to be marba birds and a mincha? Pigel could apply even the lug of oil of a mitzayra, which remember there was a lug of oil part of the service, which they would take this oil, sprinkle a little bit towards the paraiches, and then put a little bit of the oil on part of the body of the Mitzayra, and the rest of the oil would be eaten by the Kahanim. How do I know pigel could apply by that as well? It's not a carbon. Talmud Loimer, the pasuk says, somewhere else. Ashahei magdishan li, that a kohen is not allowed to eat any carbon that has a tuma, includes anything. Now, v'asu noiser. So now I'm going to tell you that noiser will also apply by everything left over. This din of noiser would also apply by any carbon, because chilil chilil metuma. I have a gzerah of chilil chilil from tuma. Noisar. It says it says by Noisa ki es kodesh Hashem chilel tuma it says v'nazru v'lo yichalalu, don't eat anything but tuma. So there's a zera shava that just like tuma applies by every carbon, so also noiser applies by every carbon, but not just any carbon, even by birds, by mincha, by log shemen, noiser applies. And also now that I know noiser applies by every carbon because you learned it out of Xera Shava, also pigel. Now I'm going to learn pigel from noiser, oven min noiser. There's a Xera Shava of pigel from noiser because it says by noiser avoin. Here, I'm going to have it over here. It says by noiser v'oichlav avoinov yisa, and it says by pigel v'nefesh achelas mimena avoinoi tisa. Right? We have this pasuk over here. So we have a gzera shava. Pigel is like noiser. And so therefore, just like noiser applies by all the carbonas, by mincha, birds, in like shaman, and how do I know noiser applies by everything? Because you learn it out from tuma, and tuma it says ashahei magdishin li. So therefore, that's how I know that pigel applies by all types of carbonas, even by the loik shaman. Says the Gemara. Okay. So now the Gemara asks this question. Okay, since the Torah eventually added that pigel applies by every type of carbon, why did the Torah single out that pigel applies by shlamim if the Torah is eventually going to include every carbon into pigel? It teaches you this idea. That means just like a shlamim has the blood that gives it the heter to be eaten by the meat eaten by a human being and the amorim be brought on the mizbeach. All parts of the animal that have something that's moderate to be eaten by a human being or by the mizbeach, that part of the animal is chayav pigel. So, for example, the blood by carbon oila, the blood is mata the meat for the mizbeach and the skin for the kahanim. By an oilas oif, the blood is mata the meat for the mizbeach. Chatas oif, doma matas besar like kahanim. By chatas oif, the blood is mata the meat for the kahanim. Parmin esrafim, simen esrafim, those carbonas that were burnt, totally burnt. In other words, you brought the blood inside the sanctuary by the mizbeach, by the proiches, sometimes by the kaddish kedoshim. So dama matis emiram karev. Their bloods, sprinkling of those bloods, allow you to bring the fats of these cows and goats onto the mizbeach to be brought. So therefore, these fats have a din of pigel. Okay, but says the Brisa, this is basically our Mishnah. Moitziani, as I'm going to exclude as a koimitz. The koimitz was the flour that you put into the basket, into the klisharis, plus the levina, the frankincense. So there, it was never eaten. It has to be brought on the mizbeach to be mata the rest of the mincha, the rest of the flour to be eaten. Kataris that's brought on the mizbeach apnimi. That's just a separate entity. It's not matter anything to eat. So if you eat kataris, it's the pigel cannot apply to kataris. Minchas kahanim, it cannot apply to minchas kahanim, minchas koy mashiach, because all those minchas are brought directly onto the mizbeach with nothing being eaten by a human being. Minchas nesachem, and here the Brisa says, minchas nesachem pigel will not apply, because that's we're going to see why not. But minchas nesachem was actually every time you brought a carbon, you brought the flour and wine onto the mizbeach as well. In addition to bringing the amorim on the mizbeach, you brought the flour and water and wine on the mizbeach. But that could be brought as a separate entity. You didn't have to bring it at the same time that you're bringing the carbon. So therefore, it's not that you did the sprinkling of the blood, now you can bring the minchas nesachim onto the mizbeach. You really, minchas nesachim has no time limit. You could bring a carbon today and then bring the minchas nesachim 3 days from now, or 10 days from now. So therefore, pigel doesn't apply. V'hadam, the blood. Again, if you sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, right, and then you eat the blood, right, from right off the mizbeach, there would be no pigel isser that you did over there because blood cannot have the blood cannot be pigel. Rab Shimon says like this: Mam shlomim yichodim sheyesh b'yamei chisim v'chayav av kol sheyesh nam mizbeach chisim chayav v'lemeshim pigel. Yatzu param and esrafim siyim and esrafim hoyo she'ein al mizbeach chisim kishlomim ein chayav v'lemeshim pigel. Rab Shimon just says basically, since the Torah only says that pigel applies by a shlamim, it's only applies, pigel only applies by karbonos that are brought on the outside mizbeach. Rab Shimon says a carbon that's brought on the inside of the sanctuary, the blood's brought on the inside of the heichal, there its pigel is not going to apply. It's not like a shlamim. So now we're going to examine this brisa. Amamar, we learned before, ki yoytze b'shlamim. My nihu. What would I, if the Torah just wrote shlamim, I would include something else the brisa said. Bechar, which is like shlamim. The nechel shnei yamim v'layla echad, I would say only bechar and shlamim pigel applies. That's what the brisa seems to imply. Says the Gemara, but my asi, how would you learn bechar from a shlamim? Even mamatzinu, if you're going to just say, if shlamim is nechel shnei yamim v'layla echad, pigel applies. Bechar also, ikal mifrach. I would ask you a question. Ma l'shlam m'shein tunas smicha unusachem tunufas chazav v'shaik. Shlamim needs smicha, nusachim, it needs a tnufas chazav v'shaik. So shlamim needs a whole bunch of mitzvahs. So therefore, pigel applies. And I would say not including bechar. Bechar doesn't; these mitzvahs don't apply. Smicha, nusachim, tnufas chazav v'shaik. So I would never say that pigel applies also by bechar. So what did the brisa mean? That if it would say shlamim, I would say that it applies to other karbanis like a shlamim. Ella says the Gemara, the Gemara says there would be a klal prata klal. Heyachel and yeyachel is klal prata klal. So the Gemara says, I would say it doesn't have to be exactly like shlamim. If it's similar to shlamim, I would include it in the mitzvah and the avera of pigel. Says the Gemara, what is that a klal prata klal? Hani trei klal de smicha adadininu. These are two klalim that are one next to another. Heyachel and yeyachel. And says the Gemara, Amarava, Kida Amri B'Marava, like they told us in the West. Kol Mokum Shata Moicha Shnei Klolos Asmuchim Zelisah. If you have two klals that are right near each other, Hata Prat Beineim V'Dinim B'Klal Prat, and judge them like a klal prat and klal. So I would imagine it says Heyachel, and it says Shlamim in between, and then Heyachel. I would say that the Avera pigel applies to anything like shlamim, klal prata klal, anything like shlamim, even bechar, even though it's not totally similar to shlamim, but it's similar enough to say that pigel would apply by shlamim and bechar by nothing else. That's why I need other psukim to be marba other karbanis. Ad shani marba loik shem and shamat. The Brisa says that by a luk shem and shamat a luk shem and shamat pigel applies, but it does not apply by minchas nesachim. So remember that. Luk shem and shel mitzayra pigel yes, minchas nesachim pigel no. So says the Gemara, Hamani, who's the author of that brisa? Rab Meir, he cannot be Rab Meir. The Tanya we learned in the brisa, Luk shem and shel mitzayra chayav m'shem pigel. They're Rab Meir. Okay, so Luk shem and shel mitzayra could be pigel. So that makes sense if you want to say the brisa is Rab Meir, but Amos Sefer. But the brisa at the end says umoitziani minchas nesachim adam, that minchas nesachim does not apply, does not have pigel. That asin l'rabbanim, that comes like the sheet of rabbanim. The Tanya we learned in the brisa. In this case, behema chayav m'shem pigel, v'bnei shadam hazevach matir l'karv divrei Meir. So Amar Loi, Adam maybe it's vachav hayam and nesachim mikan asara yamim. Our Mishnah says that the Chacham says by minchas nesachim, because it's technically can be brought at any time, pigel does not apply. So that only goes according to the Chachamim, because Rameir says by minchas nesachim, if it's brought with the zevach, pigel would apply. And our brisa says By loik shemen, pigel applies. By minchas nesachim, pigel doesn't apply. So, who is the author of the brisa? If it's Rameir, then minchas nesachim should also have pigel. If it's Rabbanan, Luke shemen shel mitzvah should not be pigel. Rav Yosef says Hamani Rebbe. The Rabbi Yosef says it possibly could be Rebbe. The Amar Rebbe says Loik Shemen Shel Mitzayra Matnoisav Sharle. What makes the Loik Shemen of a Mitzayra be allowed to be eaten by the Kohanim is if you sprinkle sprinkle the Loik Shemen towards the Paroiches. Umit Matnoisav Sharle Matnoisav Mafalgale. And since it has a heter, when could you only eat the loik shemen? Only after you put the oil by the proiches. So then it has a matn, it has a matir, and therefore it could make it pigel. Therefore, the loik shemen could become pigel, and that's the opinion of Rebbe. Tanya, we learned in the brayza, look shemen shamatzorim alim ba'em achjizur kadam. The Nizur Kadam loinam v'loimal. The Chachamim hold that Luk Shem and Shamatzayra has mi'ila to it until you sprinkle the blood of the Asham. Once you sprinkle the blood of the Asham, then you can't benefit from the Luk Shem, but you don't have mi'ila with it. Rabbi, I met my Alin. You do get mi'ila on this Luk Shem and Amitzayra. It's like really kachim, and it doesn't really belong to the Kahanim. Until you actually give matnoisav, you put it on the seva hazois towards the proiches. So therefore, Rebbe says the only heter that takes the kedusha off this Luke shemen is only if after you sprinkle towards 7 hazois towards the proiches. So Vishavim, but they both agree, Kohen should not eat it, that you don't eat it until you did the matan sheva towards the paraikas, and also put a little oil on the body of the mitzayra. So we see that Rebbe holds the kedusha only leaves the Luk Shemen of Mitzayra only after you did the gifts towards the paraikas. So the Luk Shemen of Mitzayra also has a matir, and therefore it could also become pigel. So Rav Yosef said, the author of the brisa that says Luk Shemen Shel Mitzayra could become pigel was Rebbe. Amru Kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah. So they said this Rabbi Yosef's teretz to Rabbi Yirmiyah. And he said, Gavra Rabbik Rabbi Yosef Leimikal Milsa. Could a great person like Rabbi Yosef say that the brisa goes according to Rebbe? How we go to Amabeis? How do we look? How about if the Atzmi dil kuni ami mat noisa sharlei v'loy mefalgin alei? What Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to say that although the kedusha doesn't leave until after you do the 7 matanos, but it still will not become pigel. It would still, you can't make it pigel. The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Luke Shem and Shel Mitzayra, Chayav and Shem Pigel Mepnesh, I'm done material behind us, the Rameir, Omer Loi the Rameir, the Chacham says, V'lo Yoda Mevi Achshami Achshav, V'lo Yigmib Kamra Sari Yomim. Omer Lehem, Hafari Lo Yamarti Ele Baba Min Asham. The Chachamim, who also agree there's a concept that you have to put the oil towards the proiches, and nevertheless, the Chachamim are strict and say that it doesn't become pigel. So Rebbe could also be that way. I mean, Rebbe could agree to the Chachamim that although you need to put it towards the paroiches, but that's not a matir for it, and therefore it's not enough for something to become pigel, make it pigel. So Rebbe would also agree to the Chachamim that it doesn't become pigel. So again, who's the author of the Mishnah? Again, the Brisa says that Loik Shem Mitzayra could become pigel. Minchas Nesachim cannot become pigel. So who's the author of the Brisa? It cannot be Rab Meir. It is Rab Meir. Loila Rab Meir. He Usami Mekan Nesachim. Just erase from the Brisa Nesachim that the Minchas Nesachim can't become pigel, because if the author is Rab Meir, it could become pigel. Amar Abai says Loilam Loitisam Mekan. Don't erase Minchas Nesachim. Tana loig haba min asham, a loig that comes with the asham, the loig mitzayra, hu adin l'sacham boy min zecha. That would also include the sachim that come at the same time that you're bringing the carbon. Even Rav Meir would agree. Rav Meir says it becomes pigel. Tani, and then the Bryce is saying the sacham boy b'fnei atzman. Rameh would agree that if you're bringing the loig by itself 10 days later, or you're bringing the minchas nesochim by itself, it doesn't become pigel. It doesn't become pigel. So the brayse is Rab Meir, and the first part of the brayse is talking about you bringing the loig shemen when you're bringing the carbon asham of the mitzvah, and that would apply by any carbon. If you bring the minchas nesachim, the minchas nesachim would also become pigel. The end of the brayse, when it says it doesn't become pigel, is referring to both minchas nesachim and loig shemen shemitzvah. Then they don't become pigel when they're not brought at the time of the carbon. Then we learned in the brayse chata ois. When you sprinkle the blood, the blood is mata, the meat of the to the kohen. Menor hanimili. How do I know this? The Tanu Levi, the Levi taught us. Kol karbonim. Let's see if I have the pasuk. Pasuk says, oh no, kol karbonim. I have it in Rashi. The Torah tells you, the Torah tells you that the Kahanim are supposed to eat the following. Anything that's kodesh kadashim in the fire, they should eat that part of the carbon in the around the Beis Hamikdash, in the Azara. So the Torah says, Tana Levi, kol karbonos, they eat every carbon, l'rabis loik shemen shematzayra. The loik shemen shematzayra belong to the Kahanim, and they eat it in the Beis Hamikdash. Sal kadaytech, I would have thought min ha'esh, that only from the fire, only carbons that are brought in the fire. But aloik shemen shamatzayra, how do you know it belongs to the kahanim? Kasar v'chmona. That's why the Torah says kol carbon, every carbon belonged to the kahanim. That's why the kol carbon teaches you that the loik shemen amatzayra belong to the kahanim. Now the Bryce discussed the chol min chasam. What is that? Every mincha belongs to the kohen. I know that from other psukim. L'rabas, this includes minchas oim and minchas katnois, those two minchas. Salka daita kamina, I would have thought, v'aklo ois mashu kupa behem. Torah tells you that the kohen eats karbonas that bring kapara. Or minchas ha'omer, lahater asya. The minchas ha'omer was brought to be mater the chadash. Or minchas chat chnois levara oven kasi. The minchas of the soite was just to see if she did an avera. So I may think the kohen doesn't eat that. It doesn't belong to the kahanim. Kamash malon, that also belongs to the kohen. Chol chatasam, l'rabas chatas oif, any chatas oif, the kohen eats it. Now chatas like oif, salkat like chamin and veli. I would think that the kohen's not allowed to eat a chatas oif, because if you take a look at the chatas oif, the way it's brought is they don't shech the bird, they stick their nail, as you can see in the picture, they stick their nail in there. So I would think that the chatas oif, the kohen shouldn't eat it because it's like nevela. Because in everywhere else, that would be considered not a good shechita. Kamash Malan, by carbon, that is considered a good shechita. It's called melika, and the bird should be eaten by the kahanim in the Beis Hamikdash. Chol ashamam, every asham, the rabbi asham is naziv asham mitzayrim. It says every asham belonged to the kohen. Salkadai techamin, I would have thought lahach shekasi, an asham nazir belongs is machshir, for him to start a new counting, and Mitzayra makes the Mitzayra allowed to join Klal Yisrael again. So I would think that it's not brought for a kapara, Kamash Malan, that even if it's not brought for a kapara, it's an asham and it should be eaten by the kahana. Says the Gemara, asham Mitzayra behedik sibihu. If you look in the Parshas Mitzayra, it says the asham of the Mitzayra should be eaten by the kahanim. So I don't need the chol ashamim to marba, to include an asham tzara to be eaten by the kahanim. I know it from the psukim elsewhere. Ella, it's only being marba asham mizara ka asham tzara, that an asham nazir is eaten by the kahanim, just like an asham tzara is eaten by the kahanim. And then finally, asher yeshuvu. The Torah tells you asher yeshuva ze gezel hager. That means the gezel hager means that normally when you steal from a person, you swore falsely, you pay the principal back plus a chaimish. You pay 20% more. So I would now. What happens if you steal from a ger and he has no relatives? Who do you pay the money to? The Torah tells you give that to the kahanim. That's Ashi Yeshuvu. It's gezel ger belongs to the kahanim, and it's really the kahan's money. Everything is the kahan's money. L'chohu shelechoyeh belongs to the kahanim. And the chatas, or every carbon that's given as a gift to the carbon to be eaten by the kahanim, it belongs to them. If they want to be mekadosh a woman with that, it belongs to them. Okay, so as Hashem, we just finished Daf Mem Dalet.